Hi, I'm Caroline Waxler. I'm delighted to be with you today and be the moderator of this session. I am the host of the Writers Guild East podcast on writing, where I typically interview showrunners and screenwriters. So it is wonderful to be with you here today. I'm also a journalist and television writer. So the person you've come to hear today is Shane Brennan. So Shane Brennan, as many of you know, has had a long and distinguished career in Australia before he came over to the US. First started as a journalist, has many amazing accomplishments that we're going to chat about, and then in a very accomplished career as a TV writer and producer. Then when he came over to the US, he made a lot of firsts. His first is he was the #2 on a show, first Australian to be #2 running a show. Then he was the first Australian showrunner. Then he was the first Australian to create a show. He also is currently president of the Australian Writers Guild and heads up a nonprofit to promote writers called Scripted Inc. So without further ado, let's welcome Shane Brennan.
There's more than one writer in Australia. Look, it has been a pretty interesting career. I will correct you on one thing.
Please.
And it's, I guess it's the reason I came to the US back in 2003. I wasn't a great Australian producer. If you're a writer in Australia, you are not a producer. If you're a producer, you're not a writer. And everyone's like, what? And that's the problem we face in Australia. That's why I left, to get the opportunity to take that idea that I've created, that vision, and put it on the screen and produce it. But that was something that didn't happen back then and still doesn't happen now.
So yeah, and that's something we're definitely going to get into and figure out what next steps you can do and everyone in this room can do. Right. So how did your career kick off? You mentioned you were a journalist.
Yeah, I left school way back then in the 70s. Remember the 70s? No, I do. I started as a journalist in Australia. You didn't go to college. You didn't get a degree. So even today, people say, where did you go to college? Where did you go to university? I didn't. Okay? I don't have, let's get it out of the way. I don't have a college degree. I didn't do a screenwriting course, okay? I did what was called a cadetship, okay? It sounds like something you do with men at sea. It was a 4-year cadetship, and in that time I learned to use a typewriter, I learned shorthand, and I finished that cadetship in 18 months. Then I fell in love, chased a girl overseas, spent nearly 3 years overseas, travelled through Asia. I was in Iran when the Shah was falling. I was in Afghanistan before the Russians, just. I've been shot at. I've been in riots. I spent that time just avoiding a lot of bad situations. And when I got back to Australia, I went back to the very newspaper that I'd quit from 3 years earlier, and they gave me a job. I stayed there 3 months. I quit the job, joined the ABC as a television reporter and a producer there, and left that after 12 months and became a writer in 1981. And all of that experience, all of that life experience that I jammed into those 2 or 3 years of travel, I still use that now. So 40 years later, nearly 40 years later, those emotional events in my life, I still tap into those. And that's why I love writers who come to writing late in life, because they bring a lifetime of emotional experience. And it is a great, I can see someone over there tapping someone else on the knee saying, go for it, definitely go for it. You have more stories and more emotional involvement in those stories if you can get that out and onto the page and onto the screen. All power to you. For younger writers, get out there and live life. That doesn't mean, do dope and steal cars, although if you want to, but, just get out there and live life, push yourself, take risks. So, yeah, I started writing professionally in 1981. The Australian system is totally different to the US system. It's a freelance system. So what that means is when the phone rings and someone offers you work, you say yes. And if you just keep saying yes until you've got so much work you they stop ringing you because you haven't delivered what you should have delivered 2 weeks earlier. So at any one time, I might have 4 or 5 projects that I was writing. Everything from kids' television to serious drama. Sitcoms. I've actually written every genre. I've also written a documentary. Only one. One was enough.
What was it
very
about?
Hard. Yeah, it's very hard.
What was the documentary about?
It was about a French art expert who came to a small town in Australia and discovered a French masterpiece. It was very interesting, very difficult to make. I think the budget was about $15,000, and it probably cost about 5 times that on someone's credit card. But it's, you know, documentaries, all power to the documentary makers for the time that they spend in finding a story, living with the story, and hopefully getting it to screen. The job we do as professional screenwriters is easy compared to what documentary makers go through.
Absolutely. Love to go back a little bit. How did you actually transition from your TV reporter job to writing scripted?
I actually wrote I met a friend who was a television journalist, and he said, "I'm going to write a movie." And I said, "What's that involve?" He said, "It's about 100 pages." I said, "Okay, I could do that." Doesn't sound that much. And I said, "So how long do you have to write?" He said, "You don't have a deadline." And I said, "Well, I can't work without deadlines." So I gave myself a 2-week deadline and wrote a movie in 2 weeks. And I thought, well, that was pretty easy. And I sent it out, and it was actually optioned. See, this is where, what little tiny story I'm about to tell you now sort of says a lot about why I am and where I am and who I am. I wrote this little movie, and I took it to a producer who just made the biggest miniseries in Australia. And back in the early 80s, miniseries were big. Limited series, they call them now, and you get them on Netflix or Hulu. And this guy loved the script, absolutely loved this script. And I didn't have an agent, I didn't have an attorney. I said, "So, you know, what about money?" You know? And he said, "Oh, well, you know, you'll get," and he quoted a figure, a very low figure, and he moved on quickly. And he said, "You know, I'm hoping I might get, there's a new young actor who's making a big impression. His name's Mel Gibson." And he said, "I think I'm going to get, approach Mel and put Mel in this movie." And I said, "Oh, wow, Mel Gibson." And he'd just done, I think, the first Mad Max movie. And I said, "How much is he going to cost?" And this producer said, "Oh, about $500,000. And I said, "Oh, well, if I could get half of what Mel's getting, I'd be happy." And he laughed and said, "Look, you might be lucky to get $25,000. And I said,
Wow.
but it's my script, it's my idea." And he said, "But people don't come to see a Shane Brennan movie, they come to see a Mel Gibson movie." And I said, "But yeah, the reason you got Mel Gibson was because of Shane Brennan's script, so that's got to be worth something." And he said, $25,000. And I said, "You're not getting it." And I took it off him. The movie was never made. But I've always been pretty bolshy. Everyone understand bolshy? It's a good Australian word.
Can you explain?
Bolshy is, no, bolshy, like the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks in Russia in the turn of last century. I wasn't alive then. You fight, you stand up, you fight. You don't get pushed around by people who are in positions of power. You push back. And I've done that all my career. So that script then became a writing sample.
Yes.
I sent it out. I gave myself 6 months to break into the industry. I sent it to the biggest television producer in the country in Australia, and I didn't hear from them for 3 months. And I phoned them, and they said, "Yeah, it's sitting on our desk. We're really sorry, we haven't read it yet."
Oh.
I said, "Okay." And he promised he'd read it, and the next day and this is going to sound really archaic, he sent me a telegram. Anyone ever got a telegram?
No.
Anyone? There's a lady up there who's got a telegram. It wasn't a gorilla one, sort of one of those. I actually had a guy deliver a telegram. I was living in the country. We didn't have a phone service. We didn't have power. Long story. You're not going to hear it. And he said, could you call us? I called.
Yeah.
And I went straight on to what was called a turnaround back then. So as a freelance writer, you came in, you did the story meeting over 2 days, you went away, you wrote your script, and if it was good, they gave you another one, and you were on what was called a 6-week turnaround. And so in that first year, I think I wrote 11 scripts.
Wow.
On average, over that, from that period, 1981 through probably right into the early 90s, I was averaging 20 scripts a year. So all of them freelance. In all of that time, I never went on to a set. I never met an actor. I never met a director.
That's unusual.
Not in Australia.
Wow.
In fact, I reached a point where I didn't watch what I wrote because I had a vision that I put on the page and I knew that someone else would take that vision over, directors, cast, producers, and they wouldn't deliver what I had in my mind. And I found that very disturbing, so I stopped watching what I wrote. So
Wow.
as a writer, I put as much as I could into the script, and you always put a little bit of yourself into every script. And every time, even after I've stopped counting, 400, 500 hours of credits, you pull your pants down every time you send a script off. Even after that much experience, if you are being true to your craft, you are scared shitless that this is the worst piece of shit that anyone's ever read, and that they're going to discover you are a fake.
Yes.
And that's, you need to feel that. You need to feel that when you send it off, that this is going to test me, is this any good? So over those years, I wrote a lot of scripts and became very good at all sorts of genres.
So how did you decide to go to Los Angeles?
Back in the mid-90s, I started doing a little bit of script. They call it script producing in Australia, and it's a credit that we are desperately fighting to have removed from the credits. The producers, in their being very generous towards writers, decided that finally they should acknowledge that we exist, and they started having what they called script producers. And right now we're fighting with them about that. That's a credit that the Writers Guild in Australia is not going to recognise. You are either an executive producer or a producer. A script producer it's a bullshit credit. So I was a script producer, and I ended up making a couple of shows for cable television in the US that were being shot in Australia, and that gave me a little connection to the US. And I started travelling to the US back in '98, and I travelled back and forward for 5 years, usually 2, 3, sometimes 4 trips a year. I'd come out for 2 weeks. I got an agent who was probably the worst agent in Hollywood, and after 12 months, I got another agent who turned out to be the nicest guy in Hollywood, a lovely agent.
What's his or her
I'm not
name?
going to tell you his name. He's no longer in the industry. But an absolutely delightful guy who I think attended the school across the street. He was a violinist.
Wow.
And realised he was the second best violinist in that year, and realised that that was never going to be good enough, and became an agent. So he was in the wrong industry, but a lovely guy. He was my agent for nearly 10 years, actually.
Wow.
And he kept saying, if you come to the US, you'll get a job in television. And for 5 years, I resisted that. I was pitching movies. I had some options picked up. I never really got that traction. And the day I decided to come to the US, he kept saying, you'll get a job. If you come here, you'll get a job. And I remember saying to him, okay, I'm going to come out and I'm going to come and live in the US, and I'll try and get onto a TV show. And he said, okay, that's the plan. That's great. And the very first day I was interviewed by 2 showrunners, and I was offered 2 jobs. And I phoned him, I said, yeah, so they both offered me a job. And he was like, what? I said, well, you said that if I came out, I'd get a job. What's the big deal? And the job I got was actually second in command, I guess, of CSI Miami. So, and the interesting thing about that is that there was an expectation, because I had so much writing experience, that I understood production.
Wow.
And I had never, I'd been on a set, in those shows that I'd produced as a script producer for the cable networks, I had been on set, but I had no power. It was like, oh, here comes that bloody writer. So I didn't really understand production at all. But they had an expectation that because of the American system where the writer is king and gets to produce, they assumed I knew what I was doing.
So how did you navigate that shortfall?
Well, actually, let me roll back, because you did ask the question, why did I come over?
Yes.
What was the catalyst for that? And then I'll answer the second part, which is a pretty crazy story. The reason I actually decided finally to make that move, on spec I wrote a telemovie, a movie of the week, whatever you want to call it. It was a telemovie which was a backdoor pilot. Okay, so it was set up to be a series. If they like the telemovie, you get the series. And at that point I had a connection with Paramount International, who no longer exist. They were Paramount's international arm. They were making and funding programs all around the world. They read this thing, they loved it. At the same time, Icon Productions, Mel Gibson's company, it's funny how that came around again. They were about to move into television. Bruce Davey, Mel's business partner and producing partner, read it. They decided they wanted to make it. So I had Mel Gibson's company, Icon Productions. I had Paramount International, and we had a great script. Under Paramount International's constitution, charter, whatever you want to call it, to invest, they had to have a local network invest in the show. And I couldn't get an Australian network to invest in it. Paramount International at that point, this was 2001, had, 2002 I think it was, they had allocated $23 million that year to make this show, $3 million for the pilot, $1 million an episode. And it may not sound like a lot, but $1 million an episode in Australia in 2001 was about $500,000 more than they were spending on a show. And this was US dollars. And I could not sell that idea in Australia because the networks didn't believe that I had Icon and Paramount, because they said, you're just a writer.
Wow.
And I said, but, I've got, well, if they're really interested, how come we didn't get a letter on Icon's paper? Or how come Paramount International are not backing? I said, they are backing it. And I got into an argument with all of the networks about me as a writer being able to produce this. And it was very embarrassing. I had to go back and say to Paramount International, I can't sell it. And at that point, they had to spend their $23 million, so they allocated something else. Never got made. So at that point, I realised I had no power as a writer. I was very successful. I had zero power in actually taking a vision and putting it on the screen. And that was the catalyst for me leaving.
That's a powerful catalyst.
It was a pretty powerful catalyst. And I'd been taking risks all of my life, and that's the other thing as writers.
Yeah.
I'm a great believer in life. Take a risk. Just get out there. If something happens, grab it. Worst thing that can happen is you fail, and you'll learn from that failure. And that's how we get good at what we do, by failing and learning from that.
Well, speaking of taking risks, so when you were on CSI Miami and they assumed you had all this experience and you didn't, how did you navigate the day-to-day?
Well, the day-to-day was, I had a fairly interesting encounter with David Caruso.
Do tell.
David? David was difficult and he had a reputation for being difficult. I ended up getting along really well with him. But the very first day that my script, and for people who don't know, you write that episode and you were then in charge of producing it. And it was pretty scary for me because I just didn't know what I was doing. And I wasn't going to tell anyone that. So I roll onto set and the showrunner had said to me, now look, if there's any issue with David, if there's any issue at all, call me. And we'll send down one of the staff writers because he likes the staff writers, they're funny. I said, well, look, if there's a problem, I'll try and deal with it. And she said, no, don't deal with it. No, just call me straight away. So I get down onto set. It's the very first scene they're shooting. And she did say, try to make him do the lines, okay? So
Trivial thing.
Trivial thing. It's like, let's do the lines. So he does, we do his coverage and he changes 2 words, which I can't remember what the sentence was. But it slightly changed the context. Not a lot, but just enough for the audience to go, huh, what? And to my ear, it was wrong. And certainly on the page, it was wrong. And I said to the director, could we get him to do that again, but do it correctly? And the director, who had a lot of experience, looked at me and said, you go tell him.
Oh, no.
So naively, I thought, well, it's on the script.
Sure.
So I walk up and I said, David, that was great, what you did. But do you think we could just do one take with, as it's written? And he looked at me like, what? Who are you? I'm the writer. And what do you want me to do? Well, could you just do that line again? And he said, okay. And I went, well, that was easy. And I walked back to the little video village and they rolled. He got halfway through it and he said something like, blah, blah, I've fucking done this. We are done. I'm done with this scene. No. I've done this already. I am leaving. And he walked off set. And as he walked away, he said, that's... by the way, I might swear a little. Okay, we good? He said, that's the fucking problem with this fucking show. Every fucking episode, another fucking amateur. And I watched him walk away, and he was walking down the side of the set towards the stage door. He said this, and he walked away, and I watched his back, and he got about 3/4 of the way down the set, and he looked back over his shoulder, and I just stared at him. And I glimpsed a little regret. I just thought, I think he thinks he may have gone too far.
Interesting.
And he left. And then I looked at the script coordinator, and I said, so on the David Caruso scale, is that like a 6? And she said, no, that's like an 8. And I went, So I phoned the showrunner and she said, come back. Come, leave the set. Just come back to the office. We'll send down one of the staff writers. And I said, no, look, I'd prefer to go and talk to him and let's get this aired. And she said, no, dude. So I came back and she then said, well, maybe we'll both go down. And I said, okay, then let's both go down. She said, no, let's not do that. No, we'll definitely send the staff writer. So she sent the staff writer, and then about an hour later, the phone rings, and she comes in, she says, David wants to see you in his trailer. And I said, okay, I'll go down and see him. And she said, no. I said, well, she said, we'll both go. And I said, look, it's better that I do it. And she said, well, all right, take John. Now, John was the police advisor on the show. And David loved him because, David said, how do you hold a gun? John showed him, how do you do this? And so John got on really well with him. John was a lovely guy. And I said to the showrunner, you know what? I think he might want to apologise to me. And she was rolling around on the floor laughing like, he has never apologised to anyone. And so I'm walking down with John, and John's saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. He said, when we get to the trailer, you stand off about 20 yards, and I'll go in first, and then I'll come out and get you if everything's cool. I said, John, I think he might want to apologise. He started laughing. He's never apologised to anyone. So we get to the trailer. I stand back. John goes up. David's man is at the door. They talk. The man goes in. John waits. The man comes out. John goes in. Then John comes out and he waves me over. And I walk in, and there's David relaxed on a big recliner. And he looked at me and said, you know what, I need to apologise to you.
No.
And to his credit, he recognised he'd gone too far. I think it was just like one fuck too many. It was... And he then proceeded to give me a 101 on his character, which was great. And after that, we got on really well. Because
That's great.
I pushed back a little. And I've always done that. You know, Australians are very blunt, we're very frank, and we say often what we think, and that can get you into a lot of trouble. It can also get you out of a lot of trouble. You can make fast friends because people respect that you're talking truth to them. And I'll always talk truth to power. Might get me killed one day, but I will.
So how long did you stay on Miami?
Okay, 1 year. I got fired the first year.
Too much truth to power or what?
Probably not quite enough. So here was the interesting thing. I was number 2. I had all of this experience, and I made the number 1, the showrunner, nervous.
Oh, that can happen.
Yeah, I didn't want your job, but there was that, this is Hollywood. It's like, okay, I've now got my own show. Who's behind me? Because they spend their life trying to become the showrunner, and you get there and you hang on to that job with all you've got. And I didn't want the showrunner's job because I didn't know how to do it. And apart from anything, that's not me. I don't take people's jobs. Yep. But I got fired. So then I went on to a little show called Summerland. Lovely show, fabulous showrunner. Laurie Loughlin, let's not go there.
We're going to spend the rest of us talking about the college admission scandal.
I have about 1 degree of separation on a number of these things, and it scares me.
It's another panel.
It's another panel, and I'll be behind a screen, and my voice will be changed.
I'd listen to that.
No, so I went to Summerland, and it was a great little show, and it got cancelled in the first year. Now, at this point, I'm living in LA. I'm renting a car month to month. I've been there 2 years. I have commitment issues. Hollywood has commitment issues with me. So I then went on to a show called One Tree Hill. And worked with Mark Schwann. Anyone who's giggling at this point knows what I just said about the 1 degree of separation.
Yes.
Mark has a few me too difficulties in his life.
Another panel.
Another panel. And after a year, I got fired. So now I've been here 3 years. I've been fired twice. I've had 1 show cancelled.
Yeah.
And the reason I got fired on One Tree Hill was the same thing, that sense of me having too much experience, and Mark had very little at that point. So all through this, each year I got fired or the show got cancelled, my agent said, look, there's a new show with Don Belisario called NCIS. No, I'm not going to send you there. No, I'm not going to send you there. Huh. And each year he said the same thing. And in the 4th year, after One Tree Hill, he said, look, Don Belisario is looking for writers, and I know I said I'm never going to send you there, but we're going to send you there for leverage because you've got another show that they want you on. Let's send you to Belisario. If he likes you, we'll leverage him wanting you to get this other job. So I go and meet Don, larger-than-life guy, a big presence, 6'4", he's quite a presence. And he's married to an Australian. And he loved me. And what I thought was leverage was CBS realising that they needed someone that Don liked to work with him. So I ended up getting the job on NCIS because CBS wanted someone to help manage Don, who had a difficult producing style. But we got on really well. It was not a difficult producer. It was kind of chaotic. I wrote 7 of the first 11 episodes of that season. Wow. Because there was nothing being written. And I went, oh, well, someone's got to do it. And I was getting bored. In the last 3 years, I'd written about 4 scripts. And I was doing that in a week back in Australia. Yeah. So I needed to write. So I wrote 7 of the first 11. And Don loved them. It worked really well. And I settled into this rhythm of being a writer on a TV show, and I got onto set and I was enjoying it. Don did say to me once, the very first time I went to set, I met the cast and I came back. They were in Valencia, we were in Hollywood. I got back to the office and he walked into my office, he said, I heard you went to set today. Why did you do that? And I said, well, I've never been to see the set. I wanted to see the eye lines. As a writer, it's good to understand, to walk the set and get the feel of it. And I met the cast, and it was just, something I needed to do. He said, good. now you've done it, you don't have to do it again.
Oh, no.
So he didn't like writers going to set. But I was happy. I was writing. I was living the dream. And I didn't want Don's job. And then at the end of that year, Don got fired.
Oh, wow.
And I got his job.
Wow.
And I got a job I didn't want.
Yes.
I got a job I didn't know how to do. And
Yes.
it was quite an experience, that very first production meeting.
How did you kind of bluff your way through it, or how did you manage that?
Bluff was really what happened. So anyone who understands or has any knowledge of the way a television show is produced, you have a pre-production meeting. So it's day one of the next episode. You're in pre-production. You sit down. Everyone reads the script. You have a meeting with the heads of department, with the director. You talk through what the show's about. You know, it's kind of the preliminary meeting, and then they go away for 7, 8 days, whatever the pre-production period is. And then you have a production meeting the day before you start shooting. So we were at pre-production on my first episode of television. And I was sitting at the pointy end of the table. And there were probably, I guess, 24 people around the table, maybe another 10 or so people just wandering in to see how the new showrunner was going to operate. And we started going through the script, and the director and the DP got into a discussion about what sort of lighting they'd use for a particular scene. And they started talking in technicalities about hotheads and all sorts of things. And I was sort of like, I think they're talking about lighting. And this little voice is going, just stay calm. And it got a little heated. And the first AD just turned to me and said, Shane, what do you want to do? And so suddenly there's like 30 people, all of their eyes turn to me and look at me. And I'm like, okay, bear with me, all right? What's a hothead? And this ripple, I watched this ripple run down the table like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. And I said, no, bear with me. Just explain what you're talking about. And they started to simplify it enough for me to understand that they wanted to put a camera on a crane to light a particular scene. And I went, and I could see I was losing them. And I said, a hothead, we call it something different in Australia. And they went, communication problems. And I said, yeah, no, that's good.
Great.
No, we definitely go with the hothead. Okay, let's move on. And so for the rest of the meeting, any time there was something come up, they'd say, we're good. We call it the same in Australia. So
That's great.
at the end of that sweat-drenched meeting, I left the office. I drove past Barnes & Noble. I went into the television production section. I got every book on how to produce television. And I spent the weekend swatting up I literally learned from books the technology and the language.
Great.
But the reality was I very quickly realised that language,
Yes.
while important when you're talking to various heads of department, that ultimately, if you fell back on story, that's what mattered.
Yeah.
And I think I became a fair to middling showrunner because of two things. I'd worked with some very bad showrunners, and I learned how not to do it. And I recognised that ultimately, it doesn't matter what language you speak, it's the language of the story and the character that is the most important. If you can explain that this scene is about this character reacting in this emotional way to this set of circumstances, that they will figure out a way to put a fucking hothead over the top so that we see it.
I should say, in a few minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. But are there lessons that you learned from writing and producing show running in the U.S. that you think Australia, you'd like to have Australia pick up?
You know, I stayed, it was a 5-year plan. I stayed 14 years. It's a hard industry to break into. It's a lot harder to break out of when you're successful. When I got back to Australia 18 months ago, 2 years ago, I felt I really had this opportunity to help Australian writers get over the problems I had I came back and it was, what was happening in 2001, 2002 when I left was still happening. Writers were not being recognised. They had no power.
Wow.
Their vision wasn't being put on the screen. It was just handed over to a producer, and most of the producers came from a technical background. And I thought we've got to change this. You could apply for funding in Australia through film funding bodies, government-sponsored film funding bodies. You had more chance of getting money if you were a producer. If there was money for script development, 60% of the money went to the producer.
Wow.
It didn't go to the script. So writers were ending up being paid little to develop things, and as a result, things weren't being developed enough. They were being put to market without a second or a third draft. And, most good writing is rewriting, and they weren't being paid to do that. So my wife and I set up a not-for-profit called Scripted Inc., and over the last into our third year, we put about $3.5 million into it, which is about 2.5 US, and we've used that money to take those scripts to an extra draft, to get writers the education they need about moving around in the market, about knowing what agents do, working with attorneys. We've had writers come to the US to work on shows for 2-3 weeks, just to shadow showrunners and writers, to get into the writers' room, just to expose them to the American system. The American system's never going to work in Australia because there's simply not the budgets, but there's a way of doing it over there that will become very much an Australian version of what you have here, where ultimately it's the writer's vision that they get to follow that vision through to production and onto the screen. So that's what we've been trying to do.
That's great. And I'd love to open it up to questions if anyone has anything. Otherwise, I have a million more questions for you. Great. You in the front row.
Hi. Just going back to your travel experience, I was just wondering if you had any anecdotes about what you learned through traveling and that you would tie that back into aspects of your career.
It's an interesting question. Keep your head down, particularly in the fire zones. I guess perseverance and risk. Look, people ask about my career, and it is about risk. Now, when we travelled, we took risks. Okay, I was 20, 21 years old, and when you're that young, you don't think about being killed by an Afghani crowd who's just been insulted by your girlfriend. That happened. It's not good. So that travel experience makes you more aware of your surroundings, and you tend to take risks because you feel you are informed about that, because you're spatially aware. So you take more risks. And when I started looking at my career later, I realised right through my career, everything that had been good about my career was because I took a risk. I didn't sit back. I could have sat back in Australia and continued to write 20 episodes a year. And, I was probably at that point the highest paid writer in Australia, but it wasn't about that. It was about, actually, I want to follow this through. I want to produce something I want to produce my vision. I can see it, but it's not getting onto the screen. So how can I do that? So I'll take a risk. And I think that travel experience made me, I guess, willing to put my head out there and hope it didn't get shot off, largely.
Have any of your experiences from travel made it into any scenes from NCIS?
Every scene. Come on. It is fascinating when you are digging deep into a character and you're looking for an emotional response to something. You fall back on how would I feel? And then you think, well, how did I feel? Because I remember something similar happened, or I've been in that situation. And you do. And I said it earlier, every script I write, there's a little something personal in there. There's something that happened to me. There's something that happened to my family. There's some emotional connection in that script that at some point in my life impacted me. And if you don't put that into your script, if there isn't a little bit of yourself that you tear off and plug into that script, then it's gonna feel like it's missing something. It's a weird thing to say, but you need to emotionally and passionately put yourself into those scripts.
Put something of yourself on the page.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Great, another one in the front row, and then get to you. Oh,
Yeah, and then that one up there.
yes, great.
You're next.
And then that one, yes.
Just a question about the rewriting process. What are some of the things that you personally, when you're rewriting, what do you question? What do you think the most important questions are for a writer to ask themselves in rewriting?
My scripts or someone else's?
Your process. Oh, actually both. Yeah.
Okay. Let me tell you about my writing process, which will help a little, and then I'll quickly talk about the way I tend to edit other people's scripts. When I write, usually the first 15 pages of a script are the hardest for me. It's a process of getting it down on the page and finding the rhythm to what you're writing. So I might write 2 pages on the first day, and then the next day I sit down, I read those 2 pages, and I'll rewrite them heavily until I feel a bit of a rhythm coming through, and then I might write another 3 pages. So the second day, at the end of the second day, I've got 5 pages. Beginning of the third day, I start again from page 1, and I rewrite those first 5 pages. By the time I get to sort of 15 pages, I've probably rewritten those 15 pages 5 or 10 times. And at that point, it clicks around 15, it's weird, but it clicks around 15, 18 pages. I know I'm in the story, I know the characters have invaded my head, and I finish the script. I don't stop then. I sit there and write until it's finished. So the first 15 pages of a script might take 4 or 5 days. The rest of the script, the next 40 pages, I'll write in one sitting. And I don't rewrite them.
Wow.
Because I've rewritten so much at the beginning that I have found that particular style and thread and voice. And, at that point, I'm just a stenographer. I'm sitting in the corner and the characters are walking and saying things and I'm writing them down as quick as I can. And I'm sometimes laughing or crying because of what they're saying. That's the way I write. It's an interesting process. Everyone has a different one. If you don't rewrite, you are not going to get there. If you rewrite, you might be lucky enough to have that process that I have. And a lot of that comes from experience too. You write 400 or 500 hours of TV. There's certain things you don't do. You go, not going down there. I remember July 2nd, Tuesday, 1987, when I went down that road. So you don't, there are certain little alarm bells that go off that come from sheer experience. When I'm rewriting someone else, I take a red pen, and most people, let's start again. Every writer overwrites. I overwrite. Every writer writes too much on the page. And, the great thing and the irritating thing about writing is when you write a really good script and you hand it to someone who's never written or never read a script before, they read it and they say, oh, this is easy. It's so simple. It's easy to follow. It looks so simple. And they haven't seen all of the stuff that you took out to make it read and be so simple. People don't appreciate, unless you're a fellow writer, you don't appreciate the skill it takes to take, 65 pages and reduce it to 55 lean, perfect, clear, precise, emotionally powerful pages. That's the skill of writing. And so that's what I just usually go out and I'm crossing things out. And I'll say, and structure, I play around with structure a lot. That process and I do that with a red pen because I'm trying to, and I'll sit down with the writer afterwards and say, okay, let's go through your script, and this is why, I try to explain it. I give a lot of notes as I change this because, so that the writer who then takes that script away is, and I do it with a red pen because I'm forcing them to rewrite it themselves. I want them to rewrite those words into their script. If I just sat there and did it on a computer, they'd read it and not see the changes I'm making, or I'm doing it for them. It's much more important that they do it. And they can come back and say, hey, you fucked up here. That's not going to work for these reasons. And I'll say, great. You found that little test I put in there. So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get them to think about what they've written and make it concise and precise. So take your script right now and if you've got a screenplay, I challenge you to take 10 pages out right now. Go home and do it.
That's a great exercise. Being told we need to wrap up, but I want to get to your question.
Hi. Mine's to do with writers' rooms, and there's a big difference between, obviously, the American system and what we have in Australia. And there's so many writers' rooms in LA in particular that people can try and get a foot in the door. In Sydney, it seems to me there's really just Home and Away is the established long-running writers' room, and I've sat in on it, it's great, it's amazing what they do, but is there more in the future coming that's going to give us a greater variety if you don't want to write, about teenagers?
Well,
there are other characters.
there still are. Look, the writer's room. Okay, dirty little secret. Cameras off. We don't have a writer's room on any show I've ever worked on, ever created. And that's not quite true. There's one where I felt we had to because everyone was so horrified when I suggested we don't. My feeling about writers' rooms is if two writers meet in a corridor and start talking about the script they're writing, that's a writer's room. The moment you formalise that, most of the writers' rooms I've worked in, both in Australia and in the US, and I'll say one thing about the Australian writers' room system when you're a freelance, it's a whole lot better because we spend 2 days in there, they're paying you for those 2 days, and at the end of day 2, you have got a fucking story because they're not going to pay you another $1. So you walk away with something. The American system tends to go on too long. There's too much time spent in the writer's room. Writer's rooms, they start at 10. If they're still going at 4 o'clock, you may as well stop. Everyone's brain dead. They're talked out. Go home. I don't like writer's rooms for most shows. Serialised shows, yes, you need them because there are serial strands that you need to actually be able to follow. A writer needs to know that 3 episodes ago this happened and in 2 episodes' time that's going to happen. So you need to be briefed on that. But in limited series or in episodic television, and probably more episodic television, you don't necessarily need a writer's room. You need a writer to come in with a great idea, and I'll kick out ideas. I can have the same writer come back with 5 ideas before I say, that's a good one. Let's develop that. And we'll spend a bit of time talking about it, and then I'll place him with another writer, and they'll talk about it some more. And then I say, all right, let's go away and start writing something. Give me a scene breakdown or a line breakdown, a one-pager. And then we take that and we talk about that some more. So it's a much more flexible, mobile writing room than sticking everyone in a room where everyone has an opinion and everyone has to be heard. And that actually can bog and slow down the system. So don't necessarily go chasing writers' rooms. Particularly in Australia.
I think you indicated we have time for one more, actually. How about you right there?
So do you think that the landscape for Australian writers has changed enough that there could be an influx of good quality content coming out within the next couple of years? Or do you think as a whole Australia really needs to work more on supporting the story rather than focusing on the production?
I think we're certainly in the process of supporting story and allowing writers to develop projects so that they are ready for market. The biggest issue right now is the market. Look, when I got back to Australia 18 months ago, I was shocked that nothing had changed. Here was this massive increase in content requirement around the world. And in 2007, the writers went on strike.
Yes.
And the showrunners all met to decide whether we were management or whether we were writers. There were 107 showrunners at that meeting. And luckily, we decided we were writers, not management, which pissed off the studios and networks a lot. So roll forward to 2015, I think it was, Hollywood Reporter or Bloomberg or someone did a study, and at that point there were 445 showrunners.
Wow.
So now there were, content requirements had just exploded. I got back to Australia and I'm looking at Netflix and there are shows being made in Scandinavia, in Spain, in South America, in England, in the US, and nothing coming out of Australia. And we had, at that point, I felt we were missing the boat. And it was just a lack of financial commitment from any of the broadcasters there to recognise that they should stop making television for quota, because we have a quota system in Australia. You must show X number of hours of Australian content every year. They were focused on that instead of focused on what I saw was, let's make some money, you know. If CBS sell a show around the world, they make money. Why don't we start making shows that the world wants to see and make some money? Just put a little bit more money into those production budgets, spend a bit more time with the writers. The networks and studios over there, broadcasters, don't like that idea, so that's why we formed Scripted Inc. to try and help the other side, which was give writers the chance to spend more time with their projects, make them better, and then use that high-quality script to attract overseas funding if necessary. And that's kind of the model that I think is going to work, where if the script is good enough, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, they don't care where it comes from. They just want a good script. You know, they want a great story. And at that point, I'm trying to reverse it. I'm trying to get the money to come to Australia so that the networks there realise, hey, we should have had a piece of that. They've got to start thinking like businesses instead of knitting circles.
I think on that note, I think we will adjourn. Before we wrap, is there any other points that you want to make that we haven't touched on here? I know there's so much we could chat about in your career.
Well, look, I think if there's any new writers out there, I just encourage you to keep writing. When I look back over the years, one of the fundamental mistakes that new writers make is that they spend too much time with one project. This is going to sound a little odd coming after what I've just said. At some point, let it go. Move on to the next thing. Even if you're not happy with it, if you spend too much time with it, you get so close to it, you will not ever make it better. It'll only make it worse. If you start to think, I can't do this anymore, stop. Move on to the next thing. You know, the well, if you are a good writer, the well is never dry. You can go back there thousands of times. You'll find something to write about. And ultimately what will happen is you'll be doing something, and that script that really pissed you off and you couldn't quite get right, one day it'll click and you'll go back and fix that problem or finish that draft or do another draft, and you'll do it really quickly and it'll be a joy. But so the trick is finish, start. Finish, start. Just keep writing, and invest in a red pen.
Thank you very much.